I think we're good to go.
All
Um,
right.
so before we start, maybe you should introduce yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, hello to those listening. I am Leone. I am the founder of the Econophysics community on Discord, and I'm also a co-founder and operations group member for INDEP, the International Network for Democratic Economic Planning, which you can find at indep.network. I'm on the events and outreach team, and that's my main focus. Is finding people to give cool talks and spread awareness. Because even 3 years ago, we were just all in our different little research group bubbles out in the ether, and it took a lot of effort and a lot of luck to run into one another and to be able to get this network off the ground. And now we're able to provide this space where everyone can come together and share their ideas, share their proposals, and engage and advance the conversation on post-capitalist systems and how to bring them about.
Uh,
And I'm also a grad student in physics at Clemson University. And I work on astrophysics as my day job. And I do teaching and other little things here and there. So I don't do anything in democratic planning professionally or for a salary or anything. I'm basically just a hobbyist who takes it seriously. So, yeah,
I, th-
that's
I think
me.
I think that describes a lot of people involved in it, including myself to a very small extent, because I can't do quite as much as some other people. But I it is really awesome what you guys are doing, and bringing people together on that basis. I unfortunately missed the conference that just happened because I had work obligations. Um, but why don't you tell me how that went and what the vibe was and anything you might have learned from it?
Sure. So to preface, there is an event coming up very soon. I believe on the 4th or the 5th. Yeah, I should know, but here, let me check. Just double check real quick. It's going to be a reflection event about the conference, where those of us who attended are going to do like a discussion where we share our thoughts about how it went and everything. So I don't want to get too much into that, but I can give a basic overview. So we had 13 panels spread across 4 days, and 39 talks, I believe, or maybe 37 talks across all those panels. Somewhere in that ballpark, right?
Hmm.
And it was very good. It was cool to see what everyone is doing, and it was great to just put faces to pixels. Like up until Montreal, we were all just doing this online and through Zoom meetings and all that stuff. And it was so good to break down that barrier between us and just get to know one another on a more personal, human level. I'm really excited about how it all went, and I'm excited for the opportunities that will now come along with having been able to put on a good conference like that. So yeah, hopefully we can keep the ball rolling, and who knows? We're only 15 months old, roughly, as an organization, and to be able to have a conference that soon, I think, is a bit unusual.
That's very impressive.
But I'm. What's up?
That's very impressive to do it that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I never like if you went and talked to me 3 years ago and you told me, hey, this is gonna lead to a few years down the line. Man, I'd have laughed you out of the room. It was just a reading group between like three people on Paul Cockshot's planning literature back when I started the Discord, and then through that Discord server, the Econophysics server, I found everyone else. From Sebcom to some great value theory people to yourself to a lesser extent, and to the various authors and practitioners in this space. And then, when it came time to build INDEP, I said yes within like a nanosecond. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Unfortunately, I'm not as active on Discord as some people. Um, I usually just am on like my social media, Twitter and Blue Sky. Um, but it's great that there's this community that's been working on these problems, which are desperately needed to be solved, in my opinion. Like, if there's going to be any hope of like moving beyond capitalism, it requires articulating these things of like what exactly, like even in like the present day, what could economic planning be used for, and what could it be used for in the future? Those are incredibly important questions. I actually
Hmm.
had.
And an equally important question is, what is economic planning? And that's one of the big things that came up as kind of a point that we all were drawn to between our talks. Like, what do we mean by planning?
Mhm,
And that was really cool to see.
interesting. Were there
And by the way, sorry, I have ADHD. I might interrupt sometimes
no
by
worries?
accident. So the event I mentioned is on Tuesday, August 5th at 6 p.m. UTC.
I'll try to tune in.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a friend who attended the conference as just an observer, um, and he runs like a like publishing collective up in Canada, um, and it does some really great fiction work. By the way, check out Andata Express. The guy who the first podcast I did was actually with him, um, and. Yeah, he said it was very interesting and it went really well. So you have some positive testimonials there. Um, the one thing I think he mentioned was that there was like lots of like people who were like, as you mentioned, like very like siloed in their own thing before now, um, and like there hasn't been so as much like a unified field on this yet, um, which is like, well, it's difficult, right? Um, because there's all these different perspectives you can take on this. Um, like reading.
Yeah, I would say that is one of the benefits of our current moment, because there isn't a leader to rally around that everyone's doing. And so there is this plurality and diversity of opinion. But one thing that was striking to me is that there is a natural agreement. There is a synthesis. You can kind of see glimpses of it here and there between all of our ideas and proposals. And I think that in itself is also really neat.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned that like there was a lot of discussion about like what exactly is economic planning. What would you say economic planning is?
Um, Well, my presentation there kind of answered that, tried to answer that in part. Um, when we talk about planning, oftentimes what comes to mind are, oh, I have some optimization problem running running as an algorithm on a supercomputer, or maybe on a bunch of redundant supercomputers to compute what must be produced.
Hmm.
That's the typical sort of picture that you see it as, but it goes a lot farther than that, because you also have to be really careful with how you go about um, measuring, deciding what measurement processes you're going to use, and to quantify your problem and quantify how far away you are from your goals. And so you have to think really carefully about what I call your socialize and their associated observables.
Hmm.
Where socialize, that's just kind of a loose term that I came up with for our collectively controlled measurement systems, processes, data schemas, and interpretive assumptions that we use to see what we care about in the world. And then observable, that's a physics term that means, basically something in the world that we attempt to isolate and quantify with some measurement process and capture within some dimensionful, semantically meaningful units of account.
Hmm. Now, this is a problem that I thought a lot about as well. And reading like the draft that you sent me earlier, like some of the things that you've been thinking about. Like you talk a bit about like public or like industrial libraries and that sort of thing, which is also something I think is very important. And I think I briefly mentioned something along to that effect in one of my blogs, about like what a potential post-capitalist future might look like. Um, but as I was developing like those ideas about like how we need to um, like incorporate like this knowledge about the production process, so that this is a thing that like the thing that is going to be subject to all of like whatever computation is going on. But it's I had a comment from Ian Wright, who basically said that it's best like to make like for the system to rely on like to not have to rely too hard on these descriptions being extremely descriptive or like detailed in a sense, because
Right.
if the whole thing is um, like there's a lot of energy that can be expended in describing things and all that stuff. There's a lot of like also ways that if you get too far into the weeds, you can actually create ways for people to circumvent um, like the controls of the system. Um, I so like the thing that I was thinking about is that like you do want to have like these descriptives of the process, and like the way that I think about it is that we do have to have concepts of the role that competition plays in like social societies, not on a market, but competition in like the most abstract, general sense of the word, because of just having like these descriptions of production and the like actual implementation of the production process, not having that be bound to like specific institutions or whatever that have that are like solely responsible for generating that knowledge, because like it should like the way I think about it, it's like, oh, if somebody introduces like a new commodity or a new good, like it would be their responsibility to draft up some notion of what the production process is, um, perhaps to some minimum standard, but like the only way to verify that is to have other people take cracks at doing the same thing or of describing it or doing it themselves, you know.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's one of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind about like the process of like in order to have like a really scientific application of of knowledge about production, you need to have like these open communities of like where things can be disputed. You know, like the proof is basically in the pudding of actually doing things, right?
Right.
And that's a,
So,
go ahead.
oh, go ahead.
No. I've been talking long enough.
Okay, so on the role of competition in society, that is one of those open questions that I think needs to be more strongly addressed. I've got some thoughts on it. They're not necessarily complete. But when we talk about we don't want specialization in the meta role of having knowledge about how plans work, part of that is going to come down to how exactly we decide who decides what.
Hmm.
So the are heuristics that determine who gets to be in what decision making roles and for what reasons, etc. We also there is an educational aspect to this where, and I've got a whole lot of thoughts on post-capitalist education systems, but that is going to be integral in reinforcing people's ability to interface with this planning system that we seek to set up. And for the issue of, so yes, you do bring up a very good point that I've been thinking about a lot too recently, which is every dimension where we specify a constraint requires an enforcement slash validation process. And so you're right in the sense that we don't want to have too much typed out variety in our planned sector. And Spiridon Samothrakis also makes this point very elegantly with his recommendation for a Lego economy, which basically says, okay, we have, and David Zachariah, I've been in conversation with him too, and we basically agree, yeah, any real post-capitalist system will have multiple sectors, including a planned sector, an unplanned sector, and an external sector. And I've heard arguments for a fourth, which is like the household sector, but a big theme of the conference was that that entire sector is just so problematic that it needs to be reworked from the ground up, more or less. you know, and that's one thing that I know you had some thoughts on as well. So maybe I'll bounce it back to you before I answer the rest of your question and just ask, what are your thoughts on like what is to be done with what people call the household sector?
Right. I definitely think that, like, what we need to do, like, that, well, one, there needs to be, like, one more major corporate form in society. That this would, in this corporate form, will probably be the basis of, like, socialist production. Um, except on, like, the very largest levels of it being, like, just regular nationalized industry or what have you. Um, because this, like, there in this, like, to imagine like a corporate form that is basically the commune, but a commune that we can imagine at different scales and formed from voluntary associations of people. Um, and Cockshot kind of gets at something like this, but I think his description of it or idea of it is very incomplete, of how people can like pool their like incomes or like a certain portion of their income to like these communal goods, like his vision of the commune. Um, it
Right.
needs
I would say that just I don't have those notes in front of me right now, but I do agree that the Cockshot Cottrell model and also there are some other models that have issues, but those issues are complementary to each other,
mhm,
and so they kind of have opposing problems.
right. But I think that this connects back to the household in an important way, in that we should be able to imagine voluntary associations of just like two people at minimum, because that's how like social graphs work. Is that that's the smallest like social connection you can have, and there's no reason that that connection shouldn't have like some autonomous and like legitimate political status, like uh, legal or whatever status, right? Um, and the most important thing I think from an economic perspective is creating systems that allow for like the rationalization of the household, and certain, whether it's like one or larger commune, or something in between. Um, that like we won't, like in a future society there might be like there wouldn't quite be taxes as they exist today, right? There could be different forms of um, like of way those connect. Like the commune is kind of based on like a mini like Oh, what's the word that was used for like the Chinese commune system? It was like internal um, taxation or something. I forget what it was. I don't think that was it. It was but the idea of like how that, as opposed to like people like buying capital for themselves, the primary capital that people will have will be ones like that they have some like legal right to, will be ones that they create themselves. Otherwise it would be like a capital that just is hierarchically owned by like whatever the largest like political structure is, or like or this whichever political structure you're a part of. Um, like so a household might be able to have like certain things in common that are like legally like their thing. Um, Communes would have their own like pool of capital that is legally their thing. Um, and this and that is what they give out to like potentially like contractors or like some production unit to provide services for them if they have the resources for that. That's kind of the idea that I have about this. Um, and but in terms of the household, I think that one of the more basic things that needs to be like steps that need to be taken is like a liberalization of one what that means, and also just as importantly, like so in terms of what that means, not just being limited to a man, a woman being married and their children, or what have you, like being have allowing arbitrary social connections between people. And the second thing being that um, whatever, like that these people by joining together in voluntary associations create like what's the word for it? A sort of mini political covenant of what binds them together, which by like a general law is not like binding in such a way that it would undermine the basic freedoms of those people, but which is binding in a certain way that creates internal sets of customs for these people. And I think that's
Yeah, that sounds like housing associations, though HOAs. Is that like where we want to go with it?
no, I don't think it's necessarily about HOAs because HOAs are not about like they are about imposing like these certain duties on homeowners because like so that they all reap this like monetary reward. I'm talking about like setting interpersonal um, like customs basically.
Yeah,
Um,
I mostly jest there, but
I mean, there is a
that
grain of
does.
truth to it in the sense that homeowners associations are a genuine part of civil society that kind of plays that role. They are kind of like the fact that they are some of the first things that might come to mind is because they are like is because it's a part of a monetary transaction, right? Or monetary sphere of the economy. Um, and the problem is that, like, from my perspective, is that we've have all of these um, specifically enumerated rights and duties for when it comes to that sphere, because of that's the way that liberalism works. That that's the only sphere where really those things are allowed to exist. Um, and the problem with that is that social reproduction is something that like was not treated that way. Is not is now something like excluded from all that from the most part, or it's only included to the extent it's professionalized. Um, and the problem with that is that these like things that were treated as like necessities in pre-capitalist societies for social reproduction are basically treated as luxuries under capitalism. That that's why civil society has been withering away the past few hundred years under capitalist social atomization. Um, so I think that this is an important point, that households, communes, everything in between need to have like a sort of covenant aspect to them of being able to create social customs and rules for their members in a certain way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You need to be able to just operate in that creative space. A few of the presenters that we had from, they were colleagues of Simone Pepin, one of the INDEP operations people who organized the mini conference.
Hmm.
Their names are Bengi, Sophie, and Audrey, and they put together some compelling presentations also on the social reproductive sector of, of the economy, and as far as you can even carve that out in the first place. And some of the striking things that, it's like, okay, so sometimes it might make sense to communalize some of the tasks in social reproduction. Like, for instance, if you have like a cafeteria in your housing block, or if you have communal daycare or something along those lines, and that can be organized however people wish. And then you also have the private aspect of social reproduction, which exists by definition outside of the realm of planning measurements, more or less, right? You might see what goes in and what comes out in a black box sort of sense, like, okay, people are checking out this many diapers and this much baby formula and this much food, etc. But you're not seeing all of the detailed use cases. You're not seeing what people are doing. All you know is that people are querying these goods from your resource stocks. Um, so, yeah, I think in addition to what you're saying, where there have to be mechanisms that people can just walk in the door and make an association or something, that has to be possible alongside just having the resources guaranteed to people so that they can do stuff. And to go back to the notion of a Lego economy, the planned sector is bare bones and focused on necessities and things that are easy to measure and quantify. Everything from electricity to infrastructure and housing and yada yada. And a lot of that is standardized so that you have a lower type variety. And then that just interfaces with the unplanned sector. And what we call the household sector kind of gets broken up between the planned and the unplanned sector in different ways. And it's just a matter of creating processes that people can engage in to build the social systems that they live under.
Hmm.
So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it is that, like, specifically, there will be, like, obviously there will some, like, the planned economy will produce these basic necessities that anybody can use to rely on. But we could also think about how, like, within households we can make a distinction between ones that are actively being, like, have a mini planning economy within them, and those that don't necessarily, that are more, that don't have like a specifically exculpated exculpate how I can't say it for some reason.
I,
um,
explicated, I guess.
explicated, yes, thank you. um, like set of like rules for the economic at like internal household economy. So like there you can imagine a situation where there are like you have an apartment block that has like a communal kitchen, has like like a certain set of rules for who's doing the laundry when, or even like certain, or someone who has that specific task, as a part of like a division of labor, or all kinds of situations where there's a division of labor within this apartment block that is set up by the commune, and there are certain rules about how that's operated and such. Versus, you can imagine like a two-person household where it's basically whatever goes, right? That they don't, it's not worth spending time to write everything down about how it's supposed to be done, right? And that there will be situations where that prevails, and situations where the rationalized like apartment block commune prevails. Um, and the commune has the advantage of, like, because it's being rationalized, it'll be more efficient for lots of families, lots of people to live in those situations, than just in an arbitrary like household. But you could imagine that there will still be people who will want to just have a smaller household where there isn't that certain structure. Some of that might come down to personality. I think that it's important that those two things like coexist with each other.
I agree, and the other major thing that matters here is reproductive labor time. There are a lot of parents hanging by a thread just by virtue of the fact that it takes a lot of work to raise kids, and many hands make light work.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so yeah, I think there's plenty of really good conversations to be had around social reproduction and identifying and learning how to counteract burnout generating mechanisms in social reproductive
Mm.
activities.
Oh, for
So,
sure. This was kind of going to be like the topic of what I was going to present on. Um, was how can we imagine like economic planning, um, for like uh, well, in general, but it applies especially acutely today to this crisis of care, whether it's for children or the elderly. And as like a population's age, that the elderly becomes more acute problem. Um, uh, and the one of the problems that we would face if we wanted to set up like an app that coordinated people to do this sorts of thing is that there are taxes on bartering, so that even if it's not a remunerated labor that you're doing, um, even if you're just getting like goods in kind for it, you're still supposed to pay taxes on it, and taxes are accounted for in cash. So whenever you make a barter transaction, you create a cash liability, even though you don't get any cash from the transaction. Um,
right, you're indebted to a money sink, and so yeah, and that just creates a massive, a massive barrier of entry and maintenance of such relations.
exactly. It also prevents like a lot of people who do um, care work for others to not get recognized for that in the same way that professionals doing it might be. So like someone who's like, I mean, people care for their own relatives and stuff all the time, but it's also like if there's a barter exchange for you to care for someone else, whether like they're doing some other labor in kind for you or whatever, there isn't any like if you don't have a contract for it or anything, if you're not getting paid for it, which you wouldn't want to like, even though these things are taxed, everybody does it so they don't pay the taxes because it doesn't leave a paper trail. Um, but that also means that you can't use this as something on your resume necessarily. Or if you could, it's not necessarily like the same thing as being a professional. Um, and the thing, so it kind of creates like we basically have created a whole shadow economy in all capitalist developed nations, where these sorts of things happen, and but it's being done on a very like um, piecemeal kind of way. It's not rationalized in any way because nobody can coordinate in a way that is like involves writing things down or using software or apps, because once that happens, once it leaves a paper trail, you open yourself up to being taxed. Now like the IRS has like made it semi-official policy to say that, oh, if it's like labor for similar types of labor, then we're not going to tax it, or we're not going to go after you for it. But that's just like an internal IRS policy. That's not the law, and it could change at any time.
Right.
So it's like the fact that this is a thing that hangs over any kind of like a economic planning thing. Like it for an individual commune, like in a physical place, it wouldn't be a problem, because it's basically like an internal household thing or whatever. Um, but as soon as like you're coordinating with people like in several different places, um, this becomes a problem. And so we can't do really like serious like economic planning in kind in the present day because of these legal barriers is the argument that I make.
Yeah, that makes sense. And um, it really shows how the capitalist sector is not passive relative to how it interacts with other sectors. It seeks to subsume them and through making it more costly in terms of human time to engage in non-capitalist forms of social organization.
Hmm.
And some of that might be accidental, some of that might be on purpose in the legal system. How, for instance, vertical coordination between firms is favored over horizontal coordination in our legal systems, at least in the U.S. I don't know about elsewhere that much, but I assume it's very similar because the same structures pop up over and over again, all across the world. So you have a sort of this goes back to an article that Nathan Tankus wrote, I think, a few years ago now, which showed how the history of the firm, where the firm came from, where the dominance of firms came from. Basically, I think it was case law in the 20s or 30s, 1920s or 30s, that basically said, okay, we're not going to favor trusts, we're not going to favor cartels, we're going to favor corporations. And I think that might have been part of the Lochner era SCOTUS decisions.
Hmm.
But that really locked in the corporate form of organizing as, legally valid, so to say.
Well, I mean, this issue also applies to corporations, right? So what happened was, in like the 70s, when you had like the whole Volcker shock and everything, people, so it's especially in like recessions, it's when people are unemployed and don't have access to cash that they seek out bartering, right? And businesses can obviously benefit from bartering too, if that they use it as a part of if they're using it to get inputs or whatever. It could be useful for them. And so many people were bartering using these barter exchanges in like the 70s and 80s is what caused the IRS to crack down on them and make this sort of thing impossible, right? Which is also really
Right.
when like the technology was emerging for these sort of like more coordinated bartering to happen at all. Um, and so there is certainly an aspect of it being like the firm, like capitalist social relations trying to exclude everything else, but really it's motivated by like the state wanting to maintain control, because once like the state, because basically there's two things. One is that capitalists and also the state rely on the circulation of money specifically in order to maintain their own ability to act, to consume things, and get access to resources, basically.
Right. Governments are currency sovereigns that issue money into existence and annihilate it upon taxation. And that is basically a pump that allows the government to, direct its source of money into whatever firms or organizations it wants to put them into, or agencies or what have you, to do whatever.
Hmm.
And being able to circulate the money is equivalent to being able to direct control over the economy, at least in an approximate sense.
Yeah. And so what happens if like the whole point is that money eventually gets used to buy labor, the means of production, the natural resources, and so on, to create all the actual use values that both capitalists and the state needs to operate. And the state does this by like creating money or doing or spending money, however it runs its monetary system, and capitalists do this just by having lots of money, to like in their personal accounts or what have you, or in their business accounts. And the problem that happens if too much of this gets pushed into like barter is that you can no longer use like the money that you have necessarily to like bring that into commanding surplus basically, um, because it's uh, it's no longer being like remunerated, all the surplus activities and stuff. Like you can have surplus in purely non like in purely in terms of goods and stuff. And capitalists can technically operate like that. Capitalists can operate without money so long as they have access to like the stores of goods, the means of production, whatever. But the states really can't, because this is unless they're also doing the same thing. So there's ways to do that for these like powerful institutions, but the way it's set up now is that specifically they're using money, and they don't want that system to be undermined.
Right. And it's also important to think about how that manifests analogically in post-capitalist systems. Um, because instead, most proposals, or a lot of proposals perhaps, have, non-transferable um, scalar units of account. I call them labor time credits and labor draft pledges, where the latter is the post-capitalist equivalent of a debt, uh, obtained by checking out a luxury type, a luxury class usable or service before putting your labor time into social reproduction. And that you're basically saying, hey, in exchange for checking out some luxury before I contribute labor time, I'm going to make my future labor time more flexible to the plan system in case an emergency crops up, or if some basic type of labor needs to be done on a moment's notice. Because our needs are arrhythmic in many cases, and they're seasonal in some cases, and it just really depends on what it is. And we just have to be able to, in order to affect rapid responses to problems, we're going to need an atmosphere and a culture of people being able to switch between tasks if they need to.
Hmm. It's
So,
interesting because I've been doing a lot of research on the economy and like the social developments that happened in ancient Mesopotamia. And one of the interesting things about it is that, like in the Neolithic period, these were all basically agricultural communal societies. And but they developed about 10,000 years ago this system of tokens and the system of seals that were the seals and tokens were used together basically to manage, administer storage of goods, which is really important if you're in an agricultural society. And maybe if there's a drought or something like that, you really need the store of goods to like maintain yourself through periods of hardship. Um, and this is basically where like surplus as something being explicitly managed within like some certain system like started happening. And really, it took several thousand years for this to go from an egalitarian communal setting to like the large inequalities of class society that we now like with Babylon and all of the societies that came after. And but the key thing there was that there was like an agnosticism of the system of signs, because once you created this authority to like see who controls access to the surplus through the system of seals. Like if you have a seal, like they would put seals on these storage vessels and on doors to storage units, and they were made out of clay, and they would put the stamp of the seal on them. And whoever had the seal had the authority to open it. Um, and in part, like because you need to control the consumption in order to prevent the surplus from being used up at any given time. And this, like originally, it started very similar to what you're describing. That this is kind of like the goal of what we're getting back to, is trying to create a system of economic coordination that has like these like sophisticated mechanisms for like social insurance and like meeting all of these needs without the authority, like the highly centralized state authority, the like the class society authority that came afterwards, which has been quite difficult to reverse. But seems more like, I mean, it's both a political and economic problem, but there is like this fundamental agnosticism to systems of signs, of who's using them, right? That is was probably a case for pessimism for the original agricultural communalists, but is probably a source of optimism for us, because it means that we can create a complex economy without class society necessarily.
Right. And this brings me back to a point, just briefly, on what Ian Wright was talking about in a recent talk that he gave,
Hmm.
um, when talking about theory of mind. And I like to draw analogies between, biological organisms and social organisms. And one of the things that struck me from his talk is that you have different levels of like, and I might be misrepresenting, just because I heard it once. I heard his talk once, and same with all the others, by the way, that I talk about. In case I get anything wrong there, that's just because I don't remember completely what all it was about. But he was talking about how there is basically an attention controller, at the quote unquote top level of cognition, and the model of the attention controller is like, uh, it's distinct in form from the other specialized features in the mind that have their own models and domains of action and so forth. I don't know. I might be majorly butchering it, but I think that stuck with me. In that, you're always going to need some sort of attention deciding mechanism at the organizational scale of the entire post-capitalist world economy, or society rather. um if the and that would have to be there, and it would activate only in response to the most extreme and dire emergencies, like if, I don't know, a super volcano goes off and, oh no, we don't have sunlight for our crops anymore for a year, and everything kicks into gear from that. Like, I think it's important to have those mechanisms in place to build a redundant, a resilient, a resilient society. We also need redundance in terms of, like, computing what is to be produced, in insofar as we do that. And by the way, just to bring it back to that point quickly too, it's not so much an issue of computing what is to be produced. I think the best analogy for the role of computing what ought to be produced is more so that of a forecaster than that of a commander. in the sense that in the National Weather Service, what you'll have is you've got all of these fancy models of the atmosphere that run on supercomputers all throughout the country. And they run these models to see what might happen down the line. And then the people making the forecasts at the NWS office, they have to supplement what the model says, make corrections here and there based on the ways that they understand that the model is often wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So um, I see the act of computing a production plan for a given time period to be analogous to forecasting the future needs of society and then preparing to act roughly in that direction with some modifications made on the ground, just from day-to-day circumstantial experience, or experience was like, okay, the our model of society within the planning mechanism is wrong in some way, and we know how it's wrong roughly most of the time. And so while the recommendation system tells us to produce 100 gadgets, we're going to produce 110 instead, because we know there's going to be a shortage if we just do 100.
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean, the difficulty with that is that, like, producing a certain amount versus a different amount also depends on, like, the inputs you get from, like, the other firms or
right.
like people and whatnot. Um, and
So you need what you need, and this goes back to your point on having these massive, this massive system of surplus management. I can see the need for something similar, so that we have shock absorbers on the post-capitalist economy, so that you can run down that stock or run it up a bit if there's a shortage or a surplus. And you just have you have to find a trade-off between inventory size and the response time of developing a new thing versus seeing that new thing come into use in society. So there are some trade-offs that you have to use in determining how big of a system of storehouses for basic necessities, all of the most important stuff that we need, everything from medicines and as far as we can store them in the first place, to PPE, to food, etc. We need to decide on what scale that should have, and there's benefits and detriments depending on what we choose relative to the scale of production and use,
mm-hmm. Well,
and also of depreciation.
yes, so depreciation is an important point. Like, the shelf life of goods is going to be key to determining the size of those things, right? Because you can forecast a certain demand, and you can have, but you can only really have a buffer stock of, like, how much is, like, going to be demanded within, like, the shelf life of whatever good it is, right?
Yeah.
And you can go beyond that, but at that point you're creating, like, this cost of throwing that thing away when it, like, gets past its shelf life. Um, is, like, just to have this larger buffer, basically.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things so in the same way that allowing legitimacy to arbitrary social forms liberates people to associate however they want.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to, we also liberate the forces of creativity from their profit constraining straitjackets. And we can probably directly, or maybe not we as in you and me, but just generally speaking, people can come up with ways to make usables that last longer, find better, newer ways to store food, etc. And we can just
No,
build that in as a priority.
yeah, this is, I definitely think, one of the reasons that, like, a socialist economy would, like, definitely be superior than the existing capitalist ones, just on the same, like, objective criteria, because what we've seen the past 50 years in particular is that a lot of goods have seen like a shorter depreciation timeline, shorter shelf lives, um, because as a means to get people to buy more. Um, and so in terms of GDP, that should technically mean that it's that real GDP is going down, or that should be a negative pressure on GDP, on real GDP, because basically that's inflation. That like those goods are not as going as far as they used to, but it's the same price. That should be counted as inflation for real GDP. Um,
I agree because money is an information store. It's transferable, so it mixes together in a messy way, of course. But ultimately, what you're ending up with is money falling out of your accounting system slower than goods are falling out of your warehouses.
mhm. I mean, well, it's basically increasing like the flow of production at the cost of like the stock of goods that people actually have, right? Um,
Yes, and capital maximizes profit by maximizing the source to waste flux of resources.
mhm, exactly. It's it's really about like maintaining the like that flow, and it's not about maintaining like the actual like living standards or like stock of things that people actually have. And this is important for like because you can imagine a situation where like a socialist economic planner can be really excellent at producing durable goods and that basically last forever. And by doing that, um, greatly increases like living standards, the objective size of the economy, um, but would not basically would not work at all in a capitalist economy. Um, but well, so I think we've. Well, do you want to comment on that, or do you want to go on to the like next topic we had in store?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're kind of preaching to the choir at this point. I think we've got the main point across there, so let's move on to the thing.
Yeah.
I watched your conversation with Derek Varn. I have been meaning for years to binge that channel. I have not had time yet, so I'll have to make a more concerted effort to do that. Like that was a good conversation. I like that, and I got a bunch of notes and stuff to touch on from that. If you want to at some point, but well, yeah, go ahead to the next thing, and we'll see what we get to.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Was a little bit about AI and semiotics, which isn't
Perfect.
unrelated from what we were talking about before, because this question of semiotics also like applies generally to defining like variables and within like a control system or what have you. Like any control system is necessarily a system of signs, right? Um, and this is and so that also applies. That's also the reason why it applies to artificial intelligence so much, um, including like the large language models we have now. But tell me what you thought about that conversation, because I'm very interested.
Okay, so I've got a few things to bring up, a few things to ask about, a few things to comment on. I'll just go down the list here. So basically, first and foremost, I take knowledge to be a socially reproduced thing.
Hmm.
I go into my university library and I see 100,000 volumes of some of the most advanced and carefully written text ever,
Hmm.
relative to our history. And it sits there and it's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. It's kind of like that, but with knowledge reproduction.
Hmm.
Like, yes, we have it in a information store sitting on a shelf, but we're not actually engaging with it or using it to solve problems in our daily lives. So, like, there's all kinds of different levels of knowledge and I've got a lot of thoughts on that when it comes to post-capitalist education systems. I think that my presentation built up to a notion of social causal learning. being at the heart of any viable post-capitalist legislative or judicial process, where you have to come up with ways to decide on how you're going to measure things, what you're going to measure, what your goals are, what the priorities of your goals are, and your constraints and all that, yada yada. And part of the inspiration for that term in particular came from the recent DeepMind paper that shows that associative learning is not enough for capturing physical regularities in the world. And I really like that, there is a little bit of perspective coming into machine learning that I don't think was there maybe 2 or 3 years ago about, how these things are actually thinking, and insofar as we can call it thought, or some, approximation or component or building block thereof. Depending on your architecture too, LLMs, okay, they're built on transformers, or they can be built on CANs or what have you. I think CANs are really Kolmogorov-Arnold networks. They're very promising, and I want to see more with them. I also think that Boolean machine learning, a la Wright, is also helpful, and I think that Clifford invariant neural networks also a big player. They are very good at capturing and learning symmetries, basically. I've also, back in the day, I wrote a whole long-winded thing, like sorting out my personal philosophy on, theory of mind, but like I hadn't read anyone by that point, so just kind of came up with my own terms. And so, to my understanding, what you call a second-order sign is what I would call a reality model.
I'm sorry, I lost you
basically.
there for a second. What was that?
To my understanding, what you would call a second order sign is what I would call a reality model.
Right. So it's so reality model. I assume that's sort of like a world model in, like.
Yes, in the sense that what it's made of are concepts relating to properties, relations, and connectives, and you can build a whole sort of like fuzzy logic on that. That's kind of what I tried to develop there, and I made a bunch of experiment-based arguments for how you could go about learning how concepts are structured. Like, for instance, if I give a classroom of school children, I give each one of them like an HSV color wheel, and I say, okay, I want you to take this pen and enclose the region of the color wheel that corresponds to red. And then I go up to the front of the class and I superimpose all of their results together, and I say, okay, so now I'm going to blur the boundary here, and this is the classroom's concept for red. And then I can, play around with like have the students talk to each other beforehand to try and come to agreements, and see how the concept of red changes under different conversation topologies. And I was thinking about that sort of stuff, like trying to come up with a theory of what a concept is, kind of, this totally absurd goal there. I've also been influenced. Oh, go ahead. Do you have a comment on that, or?
Well, I guess so. I would say that that's a related thing. It's not quite the same thing as like a higher order sign as I'm talking about it, because
right. And what I'm outlining with that example is just like, okay, it is a pretty simple concept. Another example is that of temperature, where the human body has, I believe, the sensory inputs for heat and cold are actually distinct channels. And so that is a two-dimensional space of experience. And you can experience both at the same time if you just put hot sauce on ice cream, But our second order sign for temperature, our model of what temperature is and what causes it, produces a quantity that lives in one dimension instead. So that's that's another cool distinction that I think clicked in my mind when I saw that when I was watching your conversation with him.
Right. So that's kind of like an example of sign function collapse, right? That like the higher order sign is this relationship between these two distinct sensory channels. But if you like concatenate those sensory channels together to become like one dimension of like variation, that becomes like a first order sign. Is how I would put it.
Okay. In what sense? Oh, do you mean like in the sense of your experience of temperature also, or
So it's basic. Well, the important thing is that anything can basically be both a first and higher order sign in terms of the signifier. So like temperature is both like both like this thing built from multiple sensory channels and whatever, but it's also this one thing that we're referring to, um, like the specific state of whatever. Um, like the higher order sign is like something. What makes a higher order sign is that it's specifically referring to like it's referring back to other signs as signs. Once you transform those other signs into like a single sign, um, and this signifier that was the higher order sign signifier refers back to that one thing that is like this one static code, like as part of a code, then that becomes like a first order sign. Um, so
that becomes a first order sign to the signifier? You said, right?
so to give the example, like the example, I mean, I might have. Well, actually, let's stick with the example of temperature, right?
Yeah.
That like so you can have a thermometer, and the thermometer has these marks for for different temperatures on it. Like this is like 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees, 30, so on. And the way that the temperature like the way that the marks stand in for a temperature is as a first order sign, just when you're naively checking a thermometer. But if you're like a scientist and you're trying to figure out exactly what the temperature of something is, you're not thinking about the the points on like the thermometer as directly referring to the temperature. You're thinking about how that sign is related to like all these other signs within like your theory of how thermodynamics work, of how like the mercury and the like the glass work, what have you, and your idea of temperature that you're thinking of as like a scientist is a higher order sign.
Right. So you have like this theoretical notion for a processes that cause
Mhm.
these measurement outcomes, basically at the level of the second order signs, and the first order signs are the measurement outcomes themselves, right?
But you do have to be careful in like naively making that distinction though, because there's always a way that you can turn a higher order sign into a lower like a first order sign. Um, so that like because once if you take like this whole model of temperature and just take it as like a fixed thing, which isn't like that like as if you know exactly what all the other signs stand for and are like combining them together into one whole thing. Like you can say that like you can speak about specific facts in your theoretical framework that are essentially acting as first order signs. Um,
Oh, so like Hamilton's principle.
what's Hamilton's principle?
The variation of the action is extremized. So basically, this is the statement underlying why Lagrange mechanics can say anything about anything.
Okay. I mean, so
And Hamilton's principle is like just an observed fact of the motion of objects, and that in itself becomes like an assumption. So maybe assumptions would count as first order in that sense. I'm just like a little bit confused on like what. And I haven't read your book yet, by the way. I need to do that, but yeah, clearly I haven't read it yet, but maybe I'm just a little bit hung up on the notion of first order versus higher order. Is if there's like like
so
okay, maybe I'll put it like this. If if you're in a lab and you're controlling different thermodynamic quantities, you might want to do a Legendre transform, sometimes in thermo. That allows you to swap the roles of the control variable and the response variable in an experiment.
mhm.
That's fundamentally what a Legendre transform does, and I think that kind of swaps the role maybe of first and second order signs, or first and higher order perhaps.
I mean, maybe I'm not quite familiar with what that transform does. Like what I would say is that anything that like any sign that's for an operation is going to be like a higher order sign when we're talking about that operation as like an actual system. But it could become like a first order sign if you're speaking about that operation as like a specific thing that like you're speaking the proper name of. So there's like the multiplication symbol as the symbol of an operation, as like something that has specific inputs and outputs and what have you, versus the multiplication symbol as a symbol which stands for um, like multiplication as like just like it's like a thing that basically it just exists. So a more like the my go-to example usually is that when you're talking about like apple juice to like a kid, and you tell them that like if they know the word apple and juice, and this is the first time they've heard the word apple juice, they'll kind of get an idea of what apple juice is based off of apple and juice as two separate signs. But they can also
Okay,
think of apple juice as a first order sign if they think of apple juice as
as its own thing.
yeah as the name of this sort of liquid or whatever.
Okay.
And these things normally, so the whole thing is that basically anything that's a higher order sign can also be a first order sign. Um,
So, in other words, signs, you can compose them,
mhm.
and what you compose them into can also be their own atomic units,
Yeah.
sort of.
Uh,
Okay.
could you give me a second? I gotta.
There for a second. My bad. Yeah. So we were at talking about how signs can compose into their own fundamental objects, and by the way, I think that also probably has some interesting ramifications in the philosophy of mathematics,
Oh, for
which I am
sure.
very underqualified to talk about, but a few things I'll mention there. And these thoughts came up in your conversation, like with Derek, about how John Bayes has put together this sort of Rosetta Stone, translating between algebraic topology with manifolds and cobordisms, and systems and processes in physics, and lemmas and proofs in logic, and categories and functors in category theory and mathematics, and machine states and programs and computation.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of beauty to that. And Lakatos also was a big influence on me. I love his proofs and reputations, really showing how math is very much just a regular old science, just like any of the others. It's old, and so because it's old, we think that the things that we've agreed upon for thousands of years are permanent truths about the world, and that's where Platonism comes from.
Hmm.
um, and it's not that extreme, of course, but I think there's an element of that in a lot of mainstream mathematicians. Um, and also, you have Corfield with his modal homotopy type theory. Have you heard of that? Do you know much about that?
No, I am also very underqualified to talk about how this applies to math. Although that didn't stop me in the book or in my blog, because
The only correct response.
um, one thing that.
But
Go ahead.
basically, it purports to provide a richer structural it provides an appropriately rich structural landscape to describe all of these under one umbrella.
Hmm.
Um, you know, um, and the Curry-Howard-Lambeck correspondence is like a building block of that, where the Curry-Howard-Lambeck correspondence basically says that to every class of programs we can assign to every program we can assign a class of proofs, and to every proof we can assign a class of programs.
Hmm.
That's basically that statement there, and you can generalize that across these other disciplines.
Hmm. So I don't know if you saw the most recent blog post I did about trying to go after rationalists a bit with like it. So I originally did it based off of this framework of first versus higher order signs, and my contention was specifically that the rationalists didn't understand that higher order signs are one required for all sorts of things of that we associate with science and super intelligence. I cited a Google DeepMind paper for that. That like open-endedness is required for super intelligence, and I think having higher order science as goals is essential for um, open-endedness, basically, and that's the argument that I make. And the problem for rationalists is that they basically their idea of what a rational goal is necessarily a first order sign. Um, and I tried to translate that into like more mathematical language for these people because that's what they're more familiar with. I don't know if I did a very good job because I'm not really familiar with that sort of notation and what have you. I didn't take that many math courses in high school and college. Um, but I this is the whole center of it is that while so I like it's not quite that like from a practical perspective, even though you can always collapse a sine function, like the difference between the first and higher order signs is that they may not have the exact same properties, and there are situations where you can have access to one but not the other. Um, and this is important for like scientific discovery because um, most of the things that we speculate about wanting to try and discover, we only know as higher order signs. We don't know what the direct reference is. That's what we're searching for, right? Um, and that's why like this distinction matters. Is the cases where there's not a clean way to collapse a sine function, or if by collapsing it, you're not getting quite the same thing that you want. Because collapsing the sine function is also basically what creates Godwin's law, and this is another thing I talk about in the book. Um, is that the only way you get Godwin's law is if this sign that like is basically correlated with this other thing, like by making this thing like a goal in like this specific way of just like directly measuring it, you're transforming it into a first order sign that doesn't like have the same like connection to like like all the things it was supposed to when it was connected to other signs as signs rather than as specific inert things. Does that make sense?
Sort of. So basically, um, you're saying that Goblin's Law comes from um, basically trying too hard to collapse higher order signs into first order signs.
I mean, it's just caused by the collapse in general, because like what like the first order sign that's created is like the problem is that it doesn't quite work for the thing like that you want, because what you're collapsing is like the is like this the signifier for the thing you're looking for into like its material substrate versus like the thing that you actually want. Um, because the thing that you actually want only really exists as a higher order sign. It's like this thing that emerges from all of these different correlations and what have you. And as soon as you're trying to specify one specific thing as standing in for that thing that you want, then you're creating a first order sign.
So this would be basically every case of an optimization logic.
Yes, exactly. This is the problem of optimization, is that any optimization that you do is necessarily making a first order sign a goal. And this is why optimization like breaks down for doing all of the complex things that we actually want, because those things are always or are generally higher order signs, and this is basically the problem that I'm pointing to at the heart of rationalism, which was always centered around these problems of optimization and always assumed that intelligence was just a better optimization problem or like solver.
Right. This is kind of like the reductio ad absurdum as well of how capital itself works, where you've got this quantity or these or the set of quantities that are denominated in monetary dimensions that you seek to optimize so that you also optimize the probability of firm reproduction, because that's ultimately what you want, is to reproduce your firm. And at some levels you have to not care about how you do that, when push comes to shove, otherwise your firm goes under. So and the same thing, like, and this is what I point out in my presentation as well, which basically is that, and another person put it nicely that, all models are wrong, some models are useful. I think it's the same thing with these optimization targets. They're all wrong. They're not to be religiously attached to, but they are useful in the sense that we can identify certain ways, certain types of measurements that couple to our goal satisfaction states, as we ourselves report. Is this goal satisfied, yes or no, in the sense of like how that higher order sign corresponding to the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and you might be able to find such dimensions, or you might find a whole priority ordered set of them that changes over time. Or they might be comparative in the sense that you're, measuring in some way the effect of a bunch of hypothetical interventions on infrastructure. And yeah, I agree that they should not form the basis of like what it is we try to do. And this goes back to what I call a social logic. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
The notion of a social logic points to basically all of the learned actions and behaviors, that you just figure out through trial and error, that tend to, help you solve these optimization problems, and social logics emerge whenever you end up with a staunch attitude towards optimizing some quantity. And it's especially troublesome if you stop talking to people and you just focus on your measurements.
Hmm. I mean, this is why the signification of desire is so important, because fundamentally, like what you're doing when you go from when you recognize that some current optimization is inadequate, what you're doing, you originally made that whatever was being optimized for, the thing you were desiring, the goal. But as you realize that's not really what you want, the sign for your desire is itself changing.
Exactly.
And that is
And I think I actually illustrate that process. Actually, did you get the slides I used? Did I send those to you?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Okay, I can send them real quick if you want to take a look at
Sure.
those. Maybe now or later on. Either way, it's all good.
Yeah. I'll
Uh,
briefly take a look now. But um, I'll probably take a closer look later.
yeah, of course. But this is kind of like the process that I talk about is, what I call social causal learning. It's all about, iteratively improving upon that. Like you start out with some arbitrary and naive guess for
Hmm.
a measurement dimension that might couple, whose measurement outputs might couple to your satisfaction states. And then you identify pathologies that come out of that, and then from those pathologies you learn what else do I need to capture
Hmm.
in my choice of measurement dimensions, schemas, assumptions, yada yada. Like it's not perfect, it's not a panacea, but it can get us at least to a programmatic starting point.
Right.
Like put it into policy, put it in, maybe not into law directly. I've got a lot of thoughts on law still, but and then here are those slides.
Thank you.
I left out the 40 megabyte GIF that I used.
I appreciate it.
But yeah, the last slide really summarizes the process that I highlight above, and at least most of it. There are some nuances at the end that kind of matter a lot, but
Yeah, I think I recognize some of the stuff from the draft you sent me.
yeah, this presentation was drawn up from the first major chapter of the draft I'm working on.
Hmm. Right. So this last slide here, I actually put the little spelled naive correctly with a special symbol. I never do that.
I just let autocorrect do it whenever it comes up.
Mm. Um, yeah, I think it's interesting. This, um, one of the major problems with the rationalists is that they're obsessed with figuring out a way to make the evolution of goals in some way stable, so that it's the goal that you have is projected forward even as you change over time, and even as you become smarter or whatever, or if you tell someone else to it, that the goal is preserved. um, and there isn't the whole Bayesian thing is about updating your beliefs about the world, but the thing that they can't countenance is this idea that your values are also updated over time. That this is something that the signification of desire is in any way a good thing, or is is to them that is just irrationality, right? Um,
Yeah,
and this is
and that basically, yeah, because rationality is, rational relative to some first order signified goal.
mm-hmm,
And that, but the problem with that is, and this is what Alejandro pointed out when he was presenting. He and I presented on the same panel together with Alex Craner. What he pointed out, is like, what is a banana?
Yeah.
If I show 10 pictures of a banana in its various stages of development to a banana farmer, he's going to say all of them. If instead I show it to a customer at a grocery store, they're only going to pick like 2 or 3, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we call stuff also depends on what our goals are.
Right.
And I thought that was also a poignant thing to point out. And it also really illustrates just how easy it is to lie with data.
True. But we still should try to get data, try to get good data. I think that,
Yes.
like that.
We have a love-hate relationship with data.
Yeah. Well, this is like one of the funny things that a lot of the left, I think, is kind of data skeptical of, skeptical of quantification in general. Um, Probably because of some attachments to continental philosophy, which I love continental philosophy, but I think that some people like take the anti-quantification too far. Maybe because they associate it with like the logic of the commodity form. Um, but you still do need quantification as a part of like scientific practice.
Yeah, you need strategic quantification.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's one of the main things that came out of the conference too. One of the main takeaways is that you have to be super careful with how you construct your information store, your information systems, your methods and reasons for accounting. And you have to be picky and careful. Otherwise, you're going to overexert yourself trying to enforce all the constraints and enforce all the goals and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
But yeah. So other stuff. Another big takeaway from your conversation with Derek was that you can use empathy to know things. And as a corollary, if you're burned by fire, you don't magically obtain knowledge of the chemical processes of burning. You obtain an experiential understanding of it. You obtain this sort of signified understanding of it, but you don't obtain like the higher order sign for a combustion reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unless you already know about it, and then it just kind of pops into your head. But especially if you're a nerd like me, and I just see all the things that are happening, it's maddening.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that was really important, and it also shows. And I really, because I'm a big analogies guy. I like analogies as they're conceptualized in physics and in math, and how they connect to what numbers are, what quantities are, etc., what they represent. And this notion that stories are analogs for social interaction and in some cases social learning. If you're reading a back and forth between people, you have a analogical stand-in for learning through conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also really important and underemphasized, because it really gives, I think, a rock solid argument for the importance of art, for the importance of coming up with a new futurism that people can kind of aesthetically latch onto as something to be desired, something that is necessary, and something that will successfully bring us out of what everyone has to also recognize as a sinking Titanic. In order to get a viable post-capitalist system, you need a life raft that works, that everyone believes works, and that people can get to without trouble, and finally that people recognize they need to get to through a tacit knowledge of the unviability of the system they're standing on.
Yeah.
All those ingredients have to be there.
For sure. And I think it would be nice if we had more like artistic depictions of like all those things involved in it. I definitely like I think Zizek pronounced like a few years ago now, probably at like 2020 or so, that capitalist realism was officially over. Which I may have been a bit little premature, but I think in general he was correct, and that like people are now able to think these things, but still like the articulation is uh, of all those things is like a real act of labor that still needs to be done that is incomplete as of yet.
Yes, and we are behind in some respects relative to where others go to. So, David Zachariah is currently preparing a where he goes through, how did the Soviet and Hungarian and so forth cyberneticians respond to some of the more steelman Austrian arguments that haven't been very well addressed in English speaking spaces. And, there's a lot of development along those lines that we just haven't really been privy to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that needs to be brought to light, and so that's exciting. I'm looking forward to reading that whenever he's got it done.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
hope for that too.
yeah, definitely. I'll let you know when it's out, or when there's a draft or something.
You know, it's funny
Um,
because I do remember reading this journal of like cybernetics with like Soviet contributors, and they're talking about artificial intelligence, but specifically like these like I can't remember exactly the word they used. There was like semiotic systems or something like that. Um, that basically they predicted exactly how LLMs would work and how they would be used in integration with other tools and stuff. Just really like like brilliant people who were um, kind of unjustly ignored by history, which is a lot of people. I've been banging the drum about structuralism and it's like how it predicted AI for quite a while now, and I am glad that like another book came out on that topic, Language Machines by Leif Weatherby, which is quite a good book. Although I disagree with all the parts about like Althusser and ideology. Hopefully, we'll have a discussion on that at some point with Weatherby. But that like there is so much of stuff that has been said and has kind of been neglected, that is important to our current moment.
yeah, and I've noticed that over a very in a much broader way. This notion that all these ideas that we have, this person over there came up with it in a different context to solve a different problem 20 years ago, and I'm noticing that in all of these disparate fields from art to process systems engineering and back again.
Mm-hmm. The world's a big
Uh,
place, and so is history. And I think people could do well to like dive into it a little bit more because there's like people I think too much rely on secondary sources for that sort of thing and don't like really know the ingenuity of just all the different people working on different things. Um,
oh,
which
yeah, 100%. It's just an unfortunate fact of nature that we can't know all of that.
yeah, yeah, we don't nobody has the time. I've literally been like trying to. I have a habit of literally playing like books, text to speech, basically anytime I have free time, and I get through a lot of books that way. But it's still just like a fraction of the things I feel like I need to know. You know?
Yeah, there was a French futurist in the 18th century who wrote about a world where, among other things, all of the books had been burned except for like a few that captured all the knowledge and put it into one place. And that was the one, like, it was like a single bookshelf of books, and that was all of human knowledge.
Uh-huh. How efficient.
Indeed.
Well, I'm
That
actually.
it's a tempting thought rabbit hole to go down there, because otherwise you just end up in the situation where we have a proliferating variety of papers, each of which is less useful than the last.
Oh, for sure.
It reminds me of the XKCD comic where it's like, oh, soon the physics journal will be publishing faster than the speed of light, but that's okay because no information is being transmitted.
That's a pretty good one.
It's
On
a
that
good.
note, I think I actually have to get going.
Okay.
I really appreciate the conversation and you taking the time to talk to me on here.
Yeah, 100%. I had one last question I wanted
Oh, sure.
to end it up. So I guess two questions. The first one is related to what we were talking about earlier. So, like, okay, so if goals are, in some sense irreducible to optimization problems, what extra structure do we have to adopt if we want to try and capture that in our quantifying procedures?
I mean, it's. I think that to some extent, like LLMs have kind of given us an answer of like the thing that, like the realness of semiotic fields gives us an indication of something that like of ways of planning and acting and thinking about like what you should be doing that isn't necessarily an optimization thing. Now, even like LLMs, like you can optimize for something within a semiotic field, and you can still create the same sort of problems. But you just have to pay. Like the way to get around that is just paying attention to how the semiotic field evolves over time. That you have the signification of desire, that basically comes from a process of active interpolation, which positions you in a specific place in that semiotic field. Um,
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
mhm.
And by semiotic field, you just mean the space of all possible signs.
Not all possible signs, but like the specific signs that like structure our symbolic universe, basically, as Lacan would put it.
Right.
Like, because you can have the space of all signs is like literally like any possible combination of symbols. But
It
basically,
gets explosively large,
yeah.
yes.
So it's just the symbols, just the set of like symbols that we're familiar with generally, is what's important there.
Right. And then the dimensions in which they can be couched.
So
But
like,
anyway, yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah, go ahead.
so think about like the vector embeddings of like the LLM and like of like the words and stuff in there is that it's not like you. I mean, you can to think about like the connections between all possible words or tokens, but really there's only just a certain amount that actually matter. Like it's pretty sparse.
Oh, yeah, that helps whenever you have sparse anything.
Yeah. And what was the second
Yeah,
question?
that makes sense. Yeah, the second question was you mentioned, okay, so culture underlies a lot of this.
Hmm.
Remind me the context in which you were talking about what culture underlies, like the you're talking about how culture um, influences semiotic fields or something along those lines.
Well, I mean, what the idea is that culture is itself the global semiotic field that we're all like swimming in, basically. That like it is like a system of signs that we're actively creating and being affected by all the time. Is I guess would be the idea.
Okay, we are accosted by concepts.
Yeah, in a sense.
Cool. Yeah, that was my question. Was basically just how do you define culture? And I think that gives a good little overview of that.
Sure.
And then yeah, I mean, I've got more to talk about, more share, etc. But I'm not going to hold you hostage for that. So yeah, we can go ahead and end off. And yeah, it's been great. Really appreciate you taking the time to have this great conversation. And I look forward to reading your work and seeing you at INDEP events maybe and stuff like that.
Yeah, likewise.
Maybe we can do an INDEP event actually if you want to.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch about that.
Sounds good.
All right, take care.
All right, you too. Peace out.